You know that feeling when you think you know someone, and then they do something that makes you realize you never really knew them at all? Well, that's exactly what happened to me 3 months ago, and it's taken me this long to even be able to talk about it without my voice shaking. But I need to tell this story because maybe, just maybe, someone out there has gone through something similar and needs to know they're not alone. Hey everyone, I'm Sarah, and if you're new here, I share real stories about family drama and the messy reality of relationships that nobody really talks about. If these kinds of honest conversations resonate with you, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and join this community where we support each other through life's toughest moments. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one. So let me start from the beginning, because the betrayal I'm about to tell you about didn't happen overnight. It was building for years, and I was too blind to see it. My name is Sarah. I'm 28 years old, and I work as a software engineer in Denver. I've always been what you'd call the responsible one in my family. While my younger sister Emma was off partying through college and changing her major every semester, I was working my way through school, getting internships, and building a career that I'm genuinely proud of. Now don't get me wrong, I never resented Emma for being different. She's always been the free spirit, the one who could make everyone laugh at family gatherings, the one who seemed to float through life without a care in the world. And honestly, part of me envied that about her. While I was stressed about deadlines and budgets and 5-year plans, Emma was just living. She had this way of making everything seem like an adventure, even grocery shopping or doing laundry. But here's the thing about being the responsible one in the family: people start to take you for granted. They assume you'll always be there to pick up the pieces, to solve the problems, to be the safety net. And somewhere along the way, I became everyone's go-to person for financial help. Not that I minded at first. When Emma needed help with her car payment after she got laid off from her retail job, I was there. When my parents needed help with their property taxes after my dad's hours got cut, I stepped up. When Emma's apartment complex raised her rent and she couldn't afford the deposit for a new place, guess who covered it? I told myself I was just being a good daughter and a good sister. Family helps family, right? That's what I was raised to believe. And I was doing well financially, better than I'd ever imagined I would be at 28. I had a 6-figure salary, a nice savings account, and I'd even started investing. I could afford to help, so why wouldn't I? But looking back now, I can see how the pattern was forming. Every time there was a financial crisis in my family, everyone's eyes would turn to me. Sarah will handle it. Sarah always figures it out. Sarah has her life together. And I did handle it every single time because I loved my family and I wanted to be someone they could count on. Emma got engaged to her boyfriend Marcus last October. They'd been together for about 3 years, and honestly, I was happy for her. Marcus seemed like a good guy. He was steady, had a decent job at a local bank, and he clearly adored Emma. He was also the first boyfriend she'd ever had who seemed to encourage her to think about the future instead of just living in the moment. When Emma called me to tell me about the engagement, she was practically vibrating with excitement. She couldn't stop talking about the ring, about how Marcus proposed at their favorite hiking spot, about how she couldn't wait to start planning the wedding. And I was genuinely thrilled for her. My little sister was getting married. This was huge. But then she started talking about the wedding itself, and I could hear the stress creeping into her voice. She and Marcus had been looking at venues, and everything was so expensive. She'd always dreamed of having her wedding at this beautiful garden venue outside the city, but the cost was astronomical. The photographer she wanted was booked solid unless she could put down a deposit immediately. The dress she'd fallen in love with was way out of her budget. The list went on and on. I found myself doing what I always did, trying to problem solve, trying to find ways to make it work. Maybe they could have the ceremony at the expensive venue but do the reception somewhere cheaper? Maybe they could get a less expensive photographer for the ceremony and splurge on the reception shots? Maybe she could find a similar dress at a consignment shop. But Emma just sighed and said something that should have been a red flag, but I didn't catch it at the time. She said, "I don't know, Sarah. I guess I'll just have to figure it out. Mom and Dad keep saying everything will work out, that I shouldn't worry about the money, that it'll all come together somehow." That phrase, "it'll all come together somehow," stuck with me. At the time, I thought it was just typical Emma optimism. She'd always been the type to believe that the universe would provide, that things would work out because they always did. But now I wonder if she already knew something I didn't. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things. Little comments here and there. When I'd talk to my mom about Emma's wedding planning, she'd get this secretive smile and say things like, "Oh, don't worry about Emma. She's going to have the wedding of her dreams." When I'd ask Emma directly about how she and Marcus were planning to afford everything, she'd just shrug and say, "We're still figuring it out, but I'm not worried." The not worrying part was what really got to me. Emma had never been cavalier about money. She'd always been stressed about it, always worried about making ends meet. So why was she suddenly so calm about funding what was clearly going to be a very expensive wedding? I started to get this nagging feeling in my stomach, this sense that something was going on that I wasn't privy to. But I pushed it down. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was looking for problems where none existed. Emma was just finally learning to be more optimistic about money, maybe. Maybe Marcus had gotten a raise. Maybe they'd decided to just put everything on credit cards and worry about it later. But then came the conversation that changed everything. It was a Sunday afternoon in November, about a month after Emma's engagement. I'd driven over to my parents' house for our usual Sunday dinner. It's a tradition we've had for years. Every Sunday, unless someone has a really good excuse, we all gather at Mom and Dad's house for dinner and catch up on the week. Usually it's just me, my parents, and Emma, though sometimes Marcus joins us too. On this particular Sunday, I'd arrived a little early because I'd promised to help my mom with some tech issue she was having with her tablet. I let myself in through the back door, like I always do, and I could hear voices coming from the living room. Mom and Dad were talking to Emma, and they were speaking in those low, conspiratorial tones that made me automatically pause and listen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, I swear. I was just standing there in the kitchen, about to call out and announce that I was there, when I heard my name. "Sarah won't mind," my mom was saying. "She's always been so generous with family, and she's doing so well right now. She can afford it. But what if she says no?" Emma's voice sounded worried. "What if she thinks it's too much?" "Honey, she's not going to say no," my dad chimed in. "She's never said no to helping family before, and this is your wedding. It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing." I stood there frozen, my heart starting to pound. They were talking about me, about my money, about asking me for something. But what? How much? "I just feel bad," Emma continued. "It's such a huge amount. I mean, $35,000 is a lot of money, even for Sarah." $35,000. My legs almost gave out. They were planning to ask me for $35,000 for Emma's wedding, without even talking to me about it first. "Emma, sweetheart," my mom said in that soothing voice she used when she was trying to convince someone of something. "Sarah has been working hard and saving money for years. She doesn't have kids. She doesn't have a house payment. She doesn't have any major expenses. She's been telling us how well she's doing financially. This is what family does for each other." "Your mother's right," Dad added. "Sarah's always been the one who takes care of everyone. She'll want to do this for you. And honestly, it's not like she's struggling. She makes more money than the rest of us combined." I felt like I was going to throw up. They were talking about me like I was some kind of ATM, like my money was somehow communal family property. They were making assumptions about my financial situation, about what I could afford, about what I would want to do. But the worst part was still coming. "So, when are you going to ask her?" Emma asked. There was a pause, and then my mom said something that made my blood run cold. "Oh, honey, we're not going to ask her. We're just going to tell her about all the arrangements we've made, and she'll offer to help. She always does. Trust me, by the time we're done talking about the venue and the photographer and everything else, she'll be volunteering to cover the costs. She'll probably even insist on it." They were manipulating me. They were planning to manipulate me into offering to pay for Emma's wedding. They had it all figured out. They'd make it sound like Emma was in a terrible situation, like she might not be able to have the wedding she wanted, and they'd count on my guilt and my love for my sister to make me step up and offer to pay. And the most terrifying part? They were probably right. If they'd done what they were planning to do, I probably would have offered. I probably would have seen Emma's disappointment and heard about all the deposits they couldn't afford and felt so guilty that I'd have volunteered to cover everything, just like I always did. "What if she figures it out?" Emma asked, and I could hear the worry in her voice. "She won't," my dad said confidently. "Sarah's too trusting. She always assumes the best about people. She'll never suspect that we planned this. I stood there in that kitchen, feeling like my whole world had just shifted. These people who I loved more than anything, who I'd been supporting and helping for years, were planning to deceive me. They were planning to manipulate me into spending $35,000, and they were so confident in their ability to do it that they weren't even nervous about it. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I heard them start to move around, like they were getting ready to come into the kitchen. I quickly backed out the door and got into my car. I sat there for probably 20 minutes, just staring at my parents' house, trying to process what I'd just heard. Part of me wanted to march back in there and confront them. Part of me wanted to call Emma and ask her how she could be okay with this. Part of me wanted to just drive away and never speak to any of them again. But mostly, I just felt sad. Sadder than I'd ever felt in my life. Because in that moment, I realized that my family didn't see me as a person with my own hopes and dreams and financial goals. They saw me as a resource to be managed and manipulated. I thought about all the times I'd helped them over the years. All the times I'd felt good about being able to solve their problems, about being the one they could count on. Had any of it been real? Had they ever actually been grateful, or had they just been pleased that their manipulation was working? I thought about my savings account, the money I'd been putting away for my own future. I'd been saving for a house down payment. I'd been saving for a sabbatical so I could travel and maybe even write a book. I'd been saving because I wanted to feel secure, because I wanted to know that I could handle whatever life threw at me. And they wanted to take $35,000 of that security away from me, not through honest conversation or direct request, but through manipulation and guilt. I didn't go back into the house that day. I texted my mom and said I wasn't feeling well and had to go home. Then I drove around for hours, just thinking. By the time I got home, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me, but I also wasn't going to confront them directly, because honestly, I was a coward. I was afraid of the fight that would ensue, afraid of the accusations that would fly, afraid of the way they'd probably turn it around and make me the bad guy for listening to their private conversation. Instead, I decided to wait and see what they did. I decided to let them try their manipulation and see how it played out. But I also decided that if they went through with their plan, I was going to turn the tables on them. The opportunity came 2 weeks later. Emma invited me over to her apartment to look at wedding magazines and talk about planning. I knew this was it. This was when they were going to execute their plan. Sure enough, Emma spent the first hour showing me all the things she wanted for her wedding. The venue, the photographer, the flowers, the dress, the band. Everything was beautiful and everything was expensive. And as she talked, I could see the stress building in her voice, the way she kept mentioning how much everything cost, how impossible it was all going to be. "I don't know what we're going to do, Sarah," she said finally, flopping down on her couch with a dramatic sigh. "Marcus and I have been looking at our budget, and there's just no way we can afford the wedding I want. I mean, we could do something really small and cheap, but I've been dreaming about this day since I was a little girl, you know." And there it was, the setup. The manipulation. The moment when I was supposed to feel so guilty about my little sister's disappointment that I'd offer to pay for everything. But instead of taking the bait, I just nodded sympathetically and said, "That's really tough, Emma. Wedding costs are just insane these days." She looked at me expectantly, clearly waiting for me to offer to help. When I didn't, she continued, "I mean, if we could just come up with about $35,000, we could have everything we want. But where are we going to get that kind of money? Our parents don't have it, and Marcus's family definitely doesn't have it." Again, I just nodded. "Yeah, that's a lot of money." I could see the confusion starting to creep into her expression. This wasn't going according to plan. "I just wish there was some way to make it work," she said, her voice getting smaller. "I hate the idea of having to settle for less than what I've always dreamed of." And that's when I made my move. "You know what, Emma?" I said, sitting up straighter. "I think I might be able to help." Her face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Really? Sarah, that would be amazing. I knew you'd understand." "Hold on," I said, holding up a hand. "Let me tell you what I'm thinking. I've been doing really well financially, and I'd love to help you have the wedding of your dreams, but $35,000 is a lot of money, even for me. So I think the best approach would be for me to loan you the money, and you and Marcus can pay me back over time." The light in her eyes dimmed considerably. "Oh, a loan. Well, yeah, I said, pretending to be surprised by her reaction. I mean, you and Marcus are both working, and you'll be building your life together. I'm sure you'll be able to pay me back pretty quickly. We could set up a payment plan, maybe $300 a month. That way you get your dream wedding, and I don't have to completely deplete my savings. Emma was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. This wasn't what she'd been expecting. This wasn't what they'd planned for. I don't know, she said finally. I mean, $300 a month for that long? That's a lot of money to commit to. It's a lot of money to give too, I said gently. But I love you, and I want to help. This seems like a good compromise. She fidgeted with her engagement ring, clearly uncomfortable. Can I talk to Marcus about it? And maybe Mom and Dad? I mean, I want to make sure we're making the right decision. Of course, I said. Take your time. Just let me know what you decide. I left her apartment feeling strangely satisfied. I'd turned their manipulation around on them. Instead of guilt-tripping me into giving them the money, I'd made them face the reality of what they were asking for. $35,000 isn't just a number. It's a huge amount of money that represents years of hard work and sacrifice. But I wasn't done yet. I had a feeling that Emma was going to go straight to our parents and tell them that I'd offered a loan instead of a gift, and I had a feeling they were going to try to convince her to find a way to get the money without having to pay it back. So I decided to get ahead of them. The next day, I called my mom and told her I wanted to take the family out to dinner to discuss something important. I suggested we go to a nice restaurant, the kind of place where people don't tend to raise their voices or make scenes. I wanted to have this conversation in a controlled environment. We met at the restaurant on a Wednesday night. Emma and Marcus were there, along with my parents. Everyone seemed a little nervous, probably because I'd been so mysterious about what I wanted to discuss. After we'd ordered and made small talk for a while, I decided to drop my bombshell. So, I said, taking a sip of my wine, Emma told me about the wedding budget situation, and I've been thinking about how I can help. Everyone at the table perked up, and I could see the relief on their faces. Sarah to the rescue, just like always. I know this wedding is really important to Emma, and I want to do everything I can to help her have the day she's dreamed of, I continued. So I've made a decision. I'm going to cover the $35,000 she needs. The table erupted in excitement. Emma started crying, Marcus looked stunned, and my parents were beaming with pride. Sarah had come through again, just like they'd known she would. But I wasn't finished. However, I said, holding up a hand to quiet everyone down, I'm not going to give Emma the money directly. Instead, I'm going to send the bill to Mom and Dad. The table went dead silent. Everyone stared at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. What? My mom finally managed to say. I'm going to pay for Emma's wedding, I said calmly, but I'm going to send the bill to you and Dad. You can pay me back over time, maybe $300 a month until it's paid off. Sarah, my dad said, his voice tight, I don't understand what you're getting at. Oh, I think you do, I said, meeting his eyes. See, I heard you guys talking a couple of weeks ago. I heard you planning how you were going to manipulate me into paying for Emma's wedding. I heard you talking about how I wouldn't mind because I don't have kids or a house payment. I heard you talking about how you were going to make it sound like Emma was desperate so that I'd feel guilty enough to offer to pay. The color drained from everyone's faces. Emma looked like she was going to be sick. Marcus looked confused and horrified. My parents looked like they'd been caught with their hands in the cookie jar. So here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice steady, despite the fact that my heart was racing. I'm going to pay for Emma's wedding, just like you wanted. But since this was your idea, since you were the ones who decided that my money should pay for Emma's wedding, you're going to be the ones who pay me back. Sarah, that's not fair, my mom said, her voice shaking. We can't afford to pay you back $300 a month. You know our financial situation. And I can't afford to give away $35,000, I said. But somehow that didn't factor into your planning, did it? We didn't plan anything, Emma said weakly. We were just talking. You were just talking about how to manipulate me into paying for your wedding, I said. You were just talking about how you could take advantage of my generosity without having to actually ask me directly. That's not what we were doing, my dad said, but he couldn't meet my eyes. Really? I said. Because from where I was standing, it sounded like you had the whole thing figured out. You were going to present me with Emma's desperate situation, and I was going to offer to pay, and everyone was going to act surprised and grateful. The silence stretched on and on. Finally, Marcus spoke up. "Sarah, I need you to know that I wasn't part of this," he said quietly. "I had no idea they were planning anything. Emma and I have been trying to figure out how to afford the wedding on our own." I looked at him, and I could see the sincerity in his eyes. Marcus had always been straightforward with me, and I believed him. "I know, Marcus," I said, "and I'm sorry you got dragged into this." "Sarah, please," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I know what we did was wrong, but I was just so scared about not being able to afford the wedding I wanted. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "But it did go this far," I said. "It went exactly as far as you planned for it to go. The only difference is that I found out about it before you could execute your plan." "So what happens now?" my mom asked. I took a deep breath. This was the moment I'd been building up to, the moment when I had to decide how I really wanted to handle this situation. "Now," I said, "you have a choice. You can accept my offer to pay for Emma's wedding and then pay me back over time, or Emma and Marcus can plan a wedding that fits within their actual budget. But I'm not going to be manipulated into giving away $35,000, and I'm not going to pretend that what you did was okay." "But Sarah," my mom said, "we can't afford to pay you back. You know we can't." "Then maybe you shouldn't have promised Emma that I'd pay for her wedding," I said. The rest of the dinner was incredibly awkward. We barely spoke, and everyone picked at their food. Finally, my dad asked for the check, and we all went our separate ways. I drove home feeling emotionally drained, but also strangely liberated. For the first time in years, I'd stood up for myself with my family. I'd refused to be taken advantage of, even though it meant causing a huge fight. But I also felt sad. Really, really sad. Because in standing up for myself, I'd had to acknowledge that my family didn't really see me as a person with my own needs and desires. They saw me as a resource, and they were willing to lie and manipulate to access that resource. The next few days were rough. Emma called me crying multiple times, begging me to reconsider. She said she was sorry, that she knew what they'd done was wrong, but that she was desperate to have the wedding she'd always dreamed of. My parents called too, but their approach was different. They were angry. They accused me of being selfish and vindictive. They said I was punishing Emma for their mistake. They said I was tearing the family apart over money. But here's the thing. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. It was about the fact that they thought they could manipulate me, that they thought I was too naive or too trusting to figure out what they were doing. After a week of phone calls and text messages and general drama, I decided to make one final offer. I called Emma and told her I'd pay for her wedding. No strings attached, no payback required, on one condition. She had to acknowledge what they'd done wrong, and she had to promise that nothing like this would ever happen again. "I need you to understand," I told her, "that what you guys did wasn't just about money. It was about trust. It was about respect. You decided that it was okay to manipulate me instead of just asking me directly for help." "I know," she said, crying. "I know it was wrong. I was just so scared that you'd say no if we asked directly." "But Emma, that's my right," I said. "I have the right to say no. I have the right to decide how I spend my money. By planning to manipulate me, you were taking away my right to make my own decisions." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You're right. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I was so focused on getting what I wanted that I didn't think about how it would affect you. And this can never happen again," I said. "If you need help in the future, you ask me directly. No manipulation, no guilt trips, no involving Mom and Dad in schemes to get money out of me. I promise," she said. "Never again." So I paid for Emma's wedding, all $35,000 of it. And you know what? It was a beautiful wedding. Emma looked absolutely radiant, Marcus was clearly over the moon, and everyone had a great time. But my relationship with my family was never quite the same after that. There was a tension there that hadn't existed before, a wariness. I think they were afraid of me, afraid that I might call them out on other things they'd been doing. And honestly, I was okay with that. Because for the first time in my life, I felt like they were seeing me as a person with boundaries, as someone who wouldn't just automatically go along with whatever they wanted. My mom and dad never apologized. Not really. They said they were sorry I'd been upset, but they never acknowledged that what they'd done was wrong. They still seemed to think that I'd overreacted, that I'd made a big deal out of nothing. But Emma was different. She called me a few weeks after the wedding and really apologized. She said she'd been thinking about what I'd said, about how they'd tried to take away my right to make my own decisions, and she realized how messed up that was. "I don't think I ever really thought about your money as being your money," she said. "I guess I just thought of it as family money, like it belonged to all of us somehow. But that's not fair, is it?" "No," I said. "It's not fair. I work hard for my money, and I should get to decide how to spend it. I'm going to do better," she said. "I'm going to make sure Marcus and I are more independent. I don't want to be the kind of person who takes advantage of family." And she has done better. She and Marcus have been working hard to build their own financial stability. They've paid me back some of the wedding money, even though I told them they didn't have to. They've stopped asking me for financial help, and when they do need advice or support, they ask directly and honestly. My relationship with my parents is more complicated. We still have Sunday dinners, and we still talk regularly, but there's a distance there that didn't exist before. They're more careful around me, more formal. Sometimes I miss the easy closeness we used to have, but I also know that closeness was based on me being willing to be taken advantage of. The whole experience taught me a lot about myself and about my family. It taught me that being generous and loving doesn't mean being a pushover. It taught me that people can love you and still be willing to manipulate you if they think they can get away with it. It also taught me that standing up for yourself is worth it, even when it's hard, even when it causes conflict. Because at the end of the day, you have to be able to live with yourself. You have to be able to look in the mirror and respect the person looking back at you. I'm not saying I handled everything perfectly. Maybe I could have confronted them more directly instead of setting up that dramatic dinner scene. Maybe I could have been more understanding about their financial stress. Maybe I could have found a way to help Emma without completely changing the dynamic of our family. But I don't regret what I did. I don't regret refusing to be manipulated, and I don't regret standing up for myself. Because for the first time in my life, I felt like I was being true to myself instead of just being what everyone else wanted me to be. The money I spent on Emma's wedding was money I'd been saving for my own future. It was money I'd planned to use for a house down payment, for travel, for security. And yes, it hurt to spend it. It hurt to watch $35,000 disappear from my savings account. But you know what hurt more? The realization that my family had been planning to manipulate me. The knowledge that they'd been sitting around talking about how to get money out of me without having to actually ask for it. Money comes and goes. I'm young, I have a good job, and I'll build my savings back up. But trust, once it's broken, is much harder to repair. I think about that overheard conversation all the time. I think about how confident my parents were that I'd never figure out what they were doing. I think about how they described me as too trusting, like that was a weakness they could exploit. And maybe I was too trusting. Maybe I was naive. But I don't think trust is a weakness. I think it's a strength. And I think the fact that my family was willing to exploit that strength says more about them than it does about me. These days, I'm more careful about financial help. When family members ask for money, I take time to think about it before I answer. I consider whether what they're asking for is reasonable, whether they're being honest with me, whether they're taking responsibility for their own financial situation. I still help when I can, but I help on my own terms. And I've learned to say no when something doesn't feel right, even if saying no causes hurt feelings or conflict. Emma's marriage is going well, by the way. She and Marcus seem really happy together, and they're building a good life. Emma has a new job that she loves, and she's been taking financial planning classes to learn how to manage money better. Sometimes she tells me about things she's learned in those classes, and I can see how much she's grown. She talks about budgeting and saving and setting financial goals, and I'm proud of her for taking control of her finances instead of just hoping someone else will solve her problems. I think the whole wedding situation was a wake-up call for her too. She realized that she'd been living in a fantasy world where money just appeared when she needed it, where problems solved themselves without her having to do the work. But Marcus has been good for her. He's helped her become more responsible and more independent, and I think she's helped him become more confident and more willing to stand up for himself. As for my parents, well, They're still my parents. I love them, and I know they love me. But our relationship is different now. They're more respectful of my boundaries, more careful about how they ask for things. And I'm more aware of the dynamics in our family, more willing to speak up when something doesn't feel right. I don't think they'll ever really understand why I was so upset about the wedding situation. I don't think they'll ever really see what they did as manipulation. But they've learned that I'm not as easy to take advantage of as they thought I was. And that's something, at least. The whole experience has made me think a lot about family dynamics and money, and the way we learn to relate to each other. I think my parents raised me to be generous and helpful, and those are good qualities. But I think they also raised me to prioritize other people's needs over my own, and that's not so good. I'm learning to find a balance. I'm learning to be generous without being a pushover, to be helpful without being taken advantage of, to be loving without being naive. It's not easy. Sometimes I second-guess myself. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being too careful, too suspicious, too selfish. But then I remember that conversation I overheard, and I remember how confident they were that they could manipulate me. And I know I'm doing the right thing. I want to be someone my family can count on, but I also want to be someone they respect. I want to be generous, but I also want to be smart. I want to help the people I love, but I also want to protect myself from being taken advantage of. It's a delicate balance, and I'm still figuring it out. But I'm getting better at it. I'm getting better at standing up for myself, at saying no when I need to, at being honest about my own needs and boundaries. And I'm getting better at recognizing when people are trying to manipulate me, whether it's family or friends or coworkers or anyone else. I'm getting better at trusting my instincts when something feels off, even if I can't quite put my finger on what's wrong. Looking back, I think the wedding situation was actually a gift, in a weird way. It was a painful gift, but it was a gift nonetheless. It showed me who my family really was, and it showed me who I really was, and it gave me the opportunity to change the dynamic between us. If I hadn't overheard that conversation, I probably would have paid for Emma's wedding without question. I would have felt good about being able to help, and I would have gone on being the family ATM for years to come. Eventually, I would have run out of money, or I would have gotten tired of always being the one who had to solve everyone's problems, and the resentment would have built up until it exploded. Instead, I got to address the problem head-on. I got to set boundaries and stand up for myself. I got to change the way my family saw me and the way I saw myself. Was it worth $35,000? I think so. I think it was worth every penny to learn that I could stand up for myself, that I could say no to manipulation, that I could demand respect from the people I love. And I think it was worth it to see Emma grow up, to see her take responsibility for her own life instead of just expecting other people to solve her problems. The months following the wedding were a period of adjustment for all of us. I found myself questioning everything about my family relationships, going back through years of interactions and wondering how many times I'd been manipulated without realizing it. It was like putting on glasses for the first time and suddenly seeing things clearly that had been blurry before. I started remembering conversations differently, like the time my dad needed help with his car repairs and spent 20 minutes telling me about how stressed he was about money before mentioning that he needed $800. Or the time my mom called me crying about their property taxes, painting this picture of potential financial ruin, only for me to find out later that they'd known about the bill for months but hadn't saved for it. Had these all been manipulation tactics? Or was I being paranoid, seeing schemes where there had only been genuine distress? The truth was probably somewhere in between, but the wedding situation had opened my eyes to the patterns in our family dynamics, patterns I'd been blind to before. I decided to start keeping a journal of my interactions with my family, particularly around money. Not because I wanted to build a case against them, but because I wanted to understand the dynamics better. I wanted to see if there were patterns I was missing, if there were ways I was contributing to the problem without realizing it. What I discovered was eye-opening. Over the course of 6 months, I documented 17 separate instances where a family member had asked me for money or financial help. 17 times in 6 months. And in almost every case, the request had been preceded by a long explanation of how dire their situation was, how they had no other options, how they didn't know what they were going to do. But here's what really got to me. In 12 of those 17 cases, the financial crisis they were describing was something they could have planned for. Car registration fees they'd known about for months. Christmas gifts they'd decided to buy without considering whether they could afford them. Utility bills that had been accumulating for weeks. I wasn't just being asked to help with genuine emergencies. I was being asked to subsidize poor financial planning, and the requests were being packaged as emergencies to make me feel guilty about saying no. This realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd been enabling my family's financial irresponsibility for years, and I hadn't even realized it. Every time I stepped in to solve their problems, I was removing the natural consequences of their choices. They didn't have to learn to budget or save or plan ahead, because Sarah would always be there to bail them out. I was helping them in the short term, but I was hurting them in the long term. And I was hurting myself too, because I was constantly depleting my savings and sacrificing my own financial goals to cover their poor choices. So I made another decision. I decided to stop enabling them. Not to stop helping entirely, but to stop automatically saying yes to every request. I developed what I called my help criteria, a set of questions I'd ask myself before agreeing to provide financial assistance. Was this a genuine emergency or a failure to plan? Had they tried to solve the problem themselves first? Were they asking for help or expecting me to solve their problem? Were they taking responsibility for their situation or just looking for someone to blame? And most importantly, would helping them actually help them? Or would it just enable them to continue making poor choices? The first time I applied these criteria was about 2 months after Emma's wedding. My mom called me in tears, saying that she and Dad were going to have their power shut off because they couldn't pay their electric bill. They needed $400, and they needed it right away. Old Sarah would have driven over with a check immediately. New Sarah asked some questions. When was the bill due? 3 weeks ago. Why hadn't they paid it? They'd spent the money on other things. What other things? Well, they'd gone out to dinner several times, and Dad had bought some new tools for his workshop, and Mom had gotten her hair done at an expensive salon. They'd had the money for the electric bill, but they'd chosen to spend it on other things. And now they wanted me to cover the consequences of that choice. Mom, I said, I understand you're stressed about this, but I'm not going to pay your electric bill. You had the money to pay it, and you chose to spend it on other things. That's a choice, and choices have consequences. She was shocked. Sarah, you can't be serious. We'll be sitting in the dark. No, you won't, I said. You'll call the electric company and set up a payment plan. You'll sell Dad's new tools if you have to. You'll figure it out, just like you would have to if I didn't exist. She hung up on me. But you know what? 3 days later, she called back to tell me that they'd worked out a payment plan with the electric company. They'd sold some things they didn't need, and they'd figured out a way to pay the bill without my help. And the most surprising thing? She actually thanked me. She said that having to deal with the problem themselves had been stressful, but it had also been empowering. They'd realized that they could solve their own problems if they had to. That was the beginning of a new pattern. My family started coming to me less often for money, and when they did, they were more thoughtful about it. They'd already tried to solve the problem themselves, and they'd have a plan for how they were going to avoid the same situation in the future. Emma, in particular, really stepped up. She started budgeting seriously, she got a better job, and she began building an emergency fund. She'd call me sometimes to talk through financial decisions, not to ask for money, but to get advice and perspective. I'm thinking about buying a new car, she'd say, but I want to make sure I'm not taking on too much debt. Can you help me think through whether this is a good idea? These conversations were so different from the old pattern. Instead of presenting me with a crisis and expecting me to solve it, she was asking for my input while taking responsibility for her own decisions. But the most profound change was in how I saw myself. For years, I'd defined myself largely by my ability to help others, by my willingness to solve problems and provide support. I'd felt valuable because I was useful, because people needed me. But that kind of self-worth is incredibly fragile. It depends on other people having problems that you can solve. It depends on being indispensable. And it can lead to some really unhealthy dynamics, both for you and for the people you're trying to help. I started going to therapy around this time because I realized that my people-pleasing tendencies went way beyond just family relationships. I was doing the same thing at work, always volunteering for extra projects, always staying late to help colleagues, always saying yes when people asked me to cover for them. My therapist helped me understand that this behavior pattern often comes from a deep-seated fear of abandonment. If I'm not useful, if I'm not solving people's problems, will they still want me around? If I say no, will they get angry and leave? But she also helped me understand that relationships based on what you can provide for someone else aren't really relationships at all. They're transactions, and transactions can be terminated as soon as they're no longer beneficial to one party. Real relationships are based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care for each other as people. They're not based on what you can do for each other, but on who you are to each other. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant I could stop constantly trying to prove my worth through my usefulness. Terrifying because it meant I had to trust that people would care about me even if I couldn't solve their problems. I started practicing saying no in small ways. When a coworker asked me to cover their shift on a Friday night, I said no because I had plans. When a friend asked me to help them move for the third time in 2 years, I said no because I was tired of being their go-to moving service. And you know what? The world didn't end. People were sometimes disappointed, but they weren't angry. They didn't abandon me. They just found other solutions to their problems, solutions that didn't require me to sacrifice my own time and energy. The hardest part was learning to sit with the discomfort of other people's disappointment. I'd been conditioned to see other people's negative emotions as my responsibility to fix. If someone was sad or stressed or overwhelmed, I felt like I had to do something to make them feel better. But my therapist helped me understand that other people's emotions aren't my responsibility. I can care about someone without being responsible for their feelings. I can empathize with their struggles without being obligated to solve them. This was a particularly hard lesson to learn with my family. Emma would call me stressed about money, and every fiber of my being would want to offer to help. It felt cruel and selfish to listen to her worry without immediately trying to fix the problem. But I learned that sometimes the most helpful thing I could do was just listen. Sometimes what she needed wasn't money or solutions. She needed someone to acknowledge her feelings and believe in her ability to handle her own problems. "I'm really stressed about Christmas gifts this year," she'd say. "I want to get everyone something nice, but I'm trying to stick to my budget." Old Sarah would have immediately offered to help pay for gifts. New Sarah would say, "That sounds stressful. What are you thinking of doing?" And then I'd listen as she talked through her options, offered suggestions when she asked for them, and supported her as she made her own decisions. And almost always, she'd figure out a solution that worked for her. These conversations were so much more meaningful than the old pattern. Instead of me swooping in to solve her problems, we were actually connecting as sisters, as equals. She was sharing her struggles with me not because she wanted me to fix them, but because she valued my perspective and support. The wedding situation had been a catalyst for all of these changes, but the real transformation had been much deeper than just learning to say no to financial requests. It had been about learning to see myself as a whole person, not just a resource for others to use. I started pursuing my own interests more actively. I took up photography, something I'd always been interested in but had never had time for because I was always busy helping other people. I started traveling, using some of the money I'd been saving before the wedding to take weekend trips and explore new places. I even started dating again, something I'd put on the back burner for years because I'd been so focused on being available for my family. I met someone through a photography class, a guy named David, who was kind and funny and who seemed to genuinely enjoy my company without expecting me to solve his problems. David was actually the one who helped me realize how much I'd changed. We'd been dating for about 3 months when my mom called with another financial crisis. She needed money for car repairs, and she was laying on the guilt thick, talking about how she and Dad were going to be stranded without a car. I listened to her whole spiel, asked my questions, and determined that this wasn't a genuine emergency. They'd been ignoring obvious signs that the car needed maintenance for months. So I told her I wasn't going to pay for the repairs, but I'd be happy to help her research mechanics and financing options. She was not happy. She accused me of being selfish and uncaring, of abandoning my family when they needed me most. She said I'd changed, and not for the better. After I hung up, I was feeling pretty shaken. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe I was overcorrecting. Maybe I really was being selfish. But David listened to the whole story and then said something that really stuck with me. Sarah, you're not responsible for managing your family's inability to manage their own lives. You're being kind and supportive, but you're not enabling them. That's not selfishness. That's healthy boundaries. He was right. I wasn't being cruel or uncaring. I was being honest and consistent. I was treating my family like capable adults who could solve their own problems rather than like children who needed constant rescuing. And slowly, it started to work. My parents began handling their own financial crises. Emma became more independent and confident. Our relationships became more balanced and more authentic. The Sunday dinners continued, but they were different now. Instead of being opportunities for family members to present their latest crises, they became actual conversations about our lives, our interests, our relationships. We talked about books we'd read, movies we'd seen, things we were excited about. Emma would tell us about her job, about projects she was working on, about goals she was setting for herself. My parents would share stories about their hobbies, their friends, their plans for retirement. I would talk about my photography, my travels, my relationship with David. We were relating to each other as whole people, not just as a collection of needs and resources. And it was so much better. I felt closer to my family than I had in years because I was actually getting to know them as people, rather than just as a series of problems to solve. But I'd be lying if I said the transition was easy. There were definitely times when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. There were moments when I felt guilty for not immediately rushing to help, moments when I wondered if I was being too rigid in my new approach. The hardest moment came about a year after the wedding. My dad had a minor heart attack, not life-threatening, but scary enough to land him in the hospital for a few days. The medical bills were substantial, and my parents were legitimately stressed about how they were going to pay them. This was exactly the kind of situation where I would have automatically stepped in before, and part of me wanted to. This wasn't a case of poor planning or irresponsible spending. It was a genuine medical emergency that could have happened to anyone. But I also knew that they had options. They could set up a payment plan with the hospital. They could look into financial assistance programs. They could make some lifestyle adjustments to free up money for the bills. Instead of immediately offering to pay, I offered to help them research their options. I spent a weekend helping them navigate the hospital's financial services department, looking into assistance programs, and creating a budget that would allow them to pay the bills over time. It was harder than just writing a check, both for me and for them. But it was also more empowering. They learned that they could handle a major financial challenge without depending on me. And I learned that I could be helpful and supportive without being financially responsible for their problems. My dad actually thanked me afterward. He said that learning to navigate the healthcare payment system had been stressful, but it had also been educational. He felt more confident about handling future medical expenses, and he discovered several resources he hadn't known existed. "You know, Sarah," he said, "I think we've been doing you a disservice all these years. We've been treating you like our personal bank instead of our daughter. That wasn't fair to you." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever gotten from him, and it meant a lot. It meant that he was finally seeing me as a person with my own needs and boundaries, not just as a resource to be managed. The wedding situation had happened almost 2 years ago now, and I can honestly say that it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. Not because I enjoyed the conflict or the drama, but because it forced me to examine my relationships and my own behavior in a way I'd never done before. I learned that love doesn't mean always saying yes. I learned that helping people doesn't always mean solving their problems for them. I learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary for healthy relationships. I also learned that people are more capable than we often give them credit for. My family had been perfectly capable of handling their own financial challenges all along. They just hadn't had to, because I'd always been there to rescue them. By stopping the rescuing, I gave them the opportunity to develop their own problem-solving skills, their own resilience, their own confidence. And that's been a gift to them as much as it's been a gift to me. Emma is thriving now in ways I never expected. She's become really good at budgeting and financial planning. She's gotten 2 promotions at work. She and Marcus are saving for a house, and they're doing it without any help from me or anyone else. But more than that, She's become more confident in all areas of her life. She's more willing to speak up for herself, more willing to take risks, more willing to trust her own judgment. I think learning to handle her own financial challenges gave her confidence that carried over into other areas. My parents are doing well too. They're more careful with their money now, more thoughtful about their spending. They've started planning for retirement more seriously, and they've actually managed to build up a small emergency fund. But the biggest change is in our relationship. We're closer now than we've ever been because our interactions are based on genuine affection rather than financial dependency. When they call me now, it's because they want to talk to me, not because they need something from me. And that feels amazing. It feels like I finally have the family relationships I'd always wanted but never knew how to create.